Some men get the call that tells them something went wrong. I got 4 days of nothing. And that silence, that complete, deliberate, chosen silence nearly hollowed me out before my own daughter said a single word to my face. You want to know what it feels like to love someone so deeply it becomes a kind of madness? I'll tell you. It feels like sitting in your truck in the driveway at 11 o'clock at night, engine off, staring at your phone like you can will it to ring. Certain your daughter is hurt somewhere. Certain something terrible has happened and nobody thought to tell the man who built his entire life around making sure terrible things never happened to her. That was me. 63 years old, sitting in a Ford F-250 I'd owned for 9 years, in the driveway of a house I'd paid off with my own hands, waiting for a grown woman to return one of my 14 calls. My name is Robert Calloway. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for a firm out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Bridges, overpasses, the kind of work where getting the math wrong means people die. I retired 4 years ago, and I do not miss a single day of it. What I built outside the office, my daughter Melissa, my son-in-law's starter business I co-signed for. The duplex I helped my son Trevor purchase in Tulsa, that's the work I thought would outlast me. That's what I poured myself into after the firm. After Carol. Carol passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. You want to talk about a silence that hollows you out? Try coming home to a house where the woman who knew every version of you is simply no longer there. I learned to carry it. You don't fix grief. You just find a way to carry it without letting it drag you under. After Carol died, I leaned into the kids harder. Melissa was 31 then, already living up in Nashville with her husband Derek, working in marketing for some downtown firm. Trevor was 28, bouncing between jobs, eventually landing in Tulsa. I helped where I could. Co-signed Derek's small business loan when their lender wanted more security, helped Trevor with the down payment on his duplex and stayed on as co-borrower. Carol would have done the same. That's what I told myself every time I wrote a check or put my name on a line of credit. Carol would have done the same. I'm telling you all of this because it matters. You need to understand who I was before that Tuesday in September. Before 4 days of nothing turned me into someone else entirely. It started with a simple piece of mail. A refinancing notice from the bank that held the note on Derek's business loan. Something in the documentation needed a cosigner signature update, procedural, routine, the kind of thing you handle in one phone call. I tried Melissa first because she handles their finances and always has. Straight to voicemail. Left a message. Easy, no urgency in my voice. Just, hey sweetheart, got something from the bank, call me when you get a minute. By the next evening, nothing. I called again. Voicemail. Then I tried Derek's cell directly. Voicemail. Then I tried the house line they still kept for some reason. It rang 8 times and died. Now, I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth hearing. My first reaction was not panic. My first reaction was mild irritation. These things happen. People get busy. Nashville is a busy city, and Melissa works long hours, and Derek is building something from the ground up. I understood all of that. I left another message, kept my voice easy. Just a bank thing, not urgent, call when you can. Day 3 is when the floor dropped out from under me. I'm a structural engineer. I know what load-bearing looks like. And I know what a foundation starting to fail feels like before you can see it with your eyes. By day 3, something in my chest was shifting the way a load shifts before a beam gives out. I called Melissa 7 times that day. 7 calls. I called Derek twice more. I called Trevor in Tulsa and asked if he'd heard from his sister. He said no, actually, come to think of it, and there was something uncertain in his voice that I didn't like one bit. That night I stood at the kitchen sink washing a single coffee cup for longer than a man should ever stand washing a coffee cup, and I thought about Carol, about how she would have known exactly what to say to me right now. Probably something practical, probably something that would have made me feel like a fool for worrying. But she wasn't there. And I was alone in a quiet house in Baton Rouge, and somewhere in Nashville, my daughter's phone was ringing and dying. 4 days of nothing is not a misunderstanding. 4 days of nothing is a choice. I drove to the airport before sunrise on a Thursday. Didn't book the flight online, just walked up to the counter and bought a ticket to Nashville, the old-fashioned way, which the woman at the counter found mildly amusing. I didn't explain myself to her. I just took my boarding pass and sat in a plastic chair, and stared at the departure board until they called my gate. The flight was barely an hour. I sat by the window and watched the flat Louisiana landscape give way to the Tennessee hills, and I thought about the day Melissa was born. The way Carol had looked at me from the hospital bed, exhausted and luminous, holding this 7-pound person like she was the most natural thing in the world, and the way I had stood there, feeling like I had no idea what I was doing, and also like I would burn down the entire world to keep this child safe. That feeling doesn't leave you. 63 years old, and that feeling had not left me for 37 years. I rented a Chevy Tahoe at the airport and drove toward Green Hills, where Melissa and Derek had bought their house 2 years prior. I'd helped with the closing costs on that house. My name wasn't on the deed, but my check had been in the room. The neighborhood was quiet, in the way that expensive neighborhoods are always quiet on a Thursday morning. Mature trees, wide driveways, the kind of street where people take their garbage cans in the same day every week. I pulled up to the curb and sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, looking at the house. 2 cars in the driveway, both cars, at 10:30 on a Thursday morning. And that's when I heard it, music. Through the front window, faint but unmistakable. Not the kind of music you put on when you're working from home on a deadline. The kind of music you put on when you're celebrating something. I walked up the front path and knocked on the door. For a moment, nothing. Then footsteps, quick and light, and then a pause right behind the door. A pause. Like whoever was there was looking through the peephole and making a decision. The door opened. Melissa stood in the frame in a dress I had never seen, holding a champagne flute, and for 1/2 second the look on her face was pure, naked surprise, and then it shifted. And what replaced it was something I had never seen on my daughter's face in 37 years of knowing it. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something colder than either of those. A kind of flat impatience, the way you look at a salesman who's knocked during dinner. Dad. Not a greeting, a statement. Like she was identifying me for someone else's benefit. I kept my voice level, because that is the only thing I know how to do when my chest is collapsing. I've been calling, Melissa, 4 days. I didn't know if something had happened to you. She shifted her weight to one hip. Nothing happened to us. We've just been busy. 4 days? I said. Every call went to voicemail. Derek's too. I told you, Dad. We're busy. We have a life here. You can't just expect us to drop everything every time you want to talk. Behind her, I could hear people. Voices, laughter, glasses. I looked past her shoulder and saw a cluster of people in their living room, the good dishes out, candles on the dining table. A celebration of some kind, clearly well underway. What's going on? I asked. She glanced back over her shoulder and then back at me, and the look she gave me was the one that finally made something cold settle in my stomach for good. It wasn't a look of a woman embarrassed to have her father show up unexpectedly. It was the look of a woman who had simply decided certain people belonged in certain places, and I was standing in the wrong one. Derek's firm just landed a major contract, she said. We're celebrating with his colleagues. It's not really a good time. I flew here from Baton Rouge, I said, because I couldn't reach you for 4 days. You shouldn't have done that. Her voice didn't crack, didn't waver. That's exactly the kind of thing we've been trying to talk to you about, Dad. You make everything about you. Every time we don't answer immediately, you catastrophize. You fly up here unannounced. You co-sign things and then act like it gives you a right to be in our lives constantly. I stood very still. The way I stand still when I'm doing calculations in my head, and I need the rest of the world to stop moving. Derek appeared behind her shoulder. He had a drink in his hand, too, and the expression he wore was the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and was deciding whether now was the time to deliver it. Robert, he said, not Dad. He had stopped calling me that sometime in the last year, and I had noticed but said nothing. Melissa and I have talked about this a lot. We need space. We need you to respect that we're adults who can manage our own lives without you hovering over every financial decision we make. I'm not hovering, I said. The bank sent a notice. I needed a signature update. That is why I called. It's always something, Melissa said. It's always some reason you need to be involved, some document, something only you can help with. We don't need you to save us anymore, Dad. We haven't needed that in a long time. I looked at my daughter, 37 years. Every school play, every soccer game in the Louisiana heat, every 3 a.m. When she was sick, and Carol and I took turns sitting on the edge of her bed so she wouldn't feel alone in the dark. 14 phone calls, over 4 days, because I genuinely believed something might have happened to her. And she was standing in her doorway with champagne and colleagues and telling me I was a burden. "I watched your number come up," she said, and her voice was quieter now, almost conversational, like she was explaining something obvious to someone slow. "I saw you calling. I just didn't feel like dealing with it. We needed this week to be about us." That's allowed, Dad. We're allowed to have things that are just about us. They saw me calling. They looked at my name on the screen, 4 days of it, and they chose the silence on purpose. 14 calls. 4 days. My daughter stood 3 feet away from me with champagne in her hand, and told me she had watched me calling and decided not to answer. Like changing a setting, like muting a notification. Behind her, one of Derek's colleagues laughed at something, loud and easy, and I stood on the front step of a house I had helped them afford, and I understood, with the terrible clarity of a man who has spent 30 years making sure structures don't fail, that something here had already failed. It had failed slowly, the way these things do, long before the visible crack appears. I did not raise my voice. I have thought about that choice many times in the months since. Whether some part of them needed to see me break. Whether rage would have landed differently than the stillness that came over me instead. But I am my father's son, in this one way, at least when the math goes wrong, you go quiet and you recalculate. You don't scream at the numbers. "All right," I said. "Enjoy your evening." I turned around and walked back to the Tahoe. I sat in that rental car for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I watched the clock. And then I drove back to the airport and got on the next flight to Baton Rouge, and I sat in seat 14A and stared out the window at the Tennessee hills, going dark in the late afternoon, and something in me went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. The house felt different when I got home. Houses do that. They hold the weight of what you carry into them. I set my bag down in the front hall and stood in the kitchen and thought about Carol for a long time. Not with grief, exactly. More like consultation. Like I was trying to hear what she would say. What she would have said, "I know this because I knew her for 34 years, is what she always said when I was making things too complicated. She would have said, "Robert, stop building a bridge over something that isn't a river. Figure out what the land actually looks like first." I slept 4 hours. At 7 in the morning, I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Oakes, who has handled my estate planning since Carol's diagnosis, when we first sat down and made sure everything was in order. Patricia is 61 years old, and she has the patience of someone who has heard every variation of human foolishness and still manages to be surprised by new ones. I told her what I needed. First, the business loan, my name as co-signer on Derek's firm. I wanted to understand my options for removing my exposure. Patricia explained it carefully. I couldn't simply withdraw in the middle of a loan term, but I could formally notify the lender that I was rescinding any future liability extensions. And given that the loan was up for its annual review in 3 weeks, the bank would be required to reassess Derek's qualification on his own merits. His merits alone, without my credit history standing behind him like a wall. I told her to send the letter. Second, Trevor's duplex in Tulsa. Trevor was different from Melissa in almost every way that mattered, and I want to be precise here because Trevor does not deserve to be painted with the same brush. But the duplex had my name on the mortgage as co-borrower, and after what Melissa had said about co-signing making me feel entitled to be in their lives, I decided to have Patricia pull that thread too. If my financial involvement was the problem, then the solution was to remove it, all of it. Let them own their own lives the way they said they wanted to. Patricia sent the letters. I went back to my life. I want to tell you what those weeks felt like, because this is the part nobody ever talks about. They talk about the decision calling the lawyer, pulling the name, closing the account. They don't talk about the nights after. The way you sit on your porch with a glass of sweet tea going warm in your hand and stare at the same yard where your daughter used to chase fireflies when she was 6, and you feel the specific weight of a love that has nowhere to go. I am not going to tell you it was easy. I am not going to perform a toughness I did not feel in those weeks. What I will tell you is that it was right. And those two things, right and easy, they very rarely live in the same house. The call from Derek came on a Wednesday, 3.5 weeks later. I was in my garage sorting through Carol's things, something I'd been putting off for 2 years, when my phone rang. I looked at his name on the screen for 2 full rings. Then I picked up. Robert. His voice was tight in a way I recognized immediately. It was the voice of a man who has just found out the wall behind him was load-bearing after all. The bank called. There's some kind of issue with the loan review. They're saying you rescinded your co-signer status, and now they need Derek to requalify independently within 30 days or the loan goes into technical default. That's right, I said. Silence on the line. Why would you do that? Melissa told me my co-signing made her feel like I was inserting myself inappropriately into your lives, I said. I'm honoring that. Robert, that is not what she meant. I think it's exactly what she meant, I said. You're both adults who don't need me hovering, so I've stopped hovering. Good luck with the requalification, Derek. I ended the call and stood in my garage in the silence and looked at a box that had Carol's handwriting on the side of it, her looping neat cursive spelling out the word kitchen, and I breathed through the tightness in my chest until it passed. Melissa called 4 hours later. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to the message. Her voice had lost the flat coolness it had on the doorstep in Nashville. She sounded scared and angry in equal measure, which in my experience is what people sound like when the world stops agreeing with their version of events. Dad, I need you to call the bank and tell them it was a mistake. Derek's firm could lose the contract they just won if his credit line gets disrupted right now. This is serious. Please call me back. I called her back the next morning. I always called back. That was never the thing in question. It wasn't a mistake, I told her. Dad, you are going to ruin everything Derek has built. Melissa, I said, and I kept my voice the way I keep it when the numbers are clear and the only thing left is to say what they mean. You told me that my co-signing things gave me an excuse to insert myself into your lives. I heard you. I'm removing that excuse. Derek's business should stand on Derek's own financial record. If it can't, that's information the bank is entitled to have. That is not fair, she said. You can't use money as a punishment. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm honoring your independence, exactly the way you asked me to. She went quiet for a moment. Then, you're doing this because you're angry. You're being vindictive. I'm being consistent, I said. You wanted space. You have it. You wanted me out of your financial life. Done. You wanted to be left alone to manage your own affairs. I respect that completely. You're twisting everything I said. I'm remembering exactly what you said, I told her. You watched me call 14 times over 4 days. On purpose. And then you told me I was the problem. Those are your words, sweetheart. I didn't invent them. The word sweetheart landed differently than I intended, I think, because she started crying. And I want to be honest with you here. That was the hardest moment. Not the door in Nashville. Not the voicemail. The crying. Because she was still my daughter, and I was still the man who had sat on the edge of her bed at 3 a.m., so she wouldn't feel alone in the dark. And some part of me, the part that doesn't obey reason, wanted to fold. Wanted to call Patricia and tell her to undo everything and go back to being the wall nobody thanks. But I thought about 14 calls. I thought about her face in that doorway. I thought about the specific sentence. I saw you calling. I just didn't feel like dealing with it. I love you, I said. That has not changed, and it will not change. But love is not the same thing as unlimited liability. I hope Derek's firm finds a solid footing. I genuinely do. Call me when you'd like to have a real conversation. I hung up. They drove down from Nashville 6 weeks later. I knew they were coming because Trevor called me first. Trevor, who had his own complicated feelings about all of this, and had spent several weeks in the uncomfortable position of being the child who actually returned calls, and told me Melissa had called him crying, and that she and Derek were planning to come to Baton Rouge. I thanked him for the heads up. Trevor asked me quietly if I was okay. I told him I had been better and I had been worse. He laughed, a little sadly, and said that sounded about right. They pulled into my driveway on a Saturday afternoon. I watched them from the kitchen window for a moment, before I opened the door. Melissa, in the passenger seat, Derek behind the wheel, both of them sitting still for a few seconds before getting out, the way people sit still before doing something they've been dreading. I let them in, made coffee, sat them down at the kitchen table where Melissa had done homework for 12 years and where Carol and I had eaten breakfast together every morning of our marriage until we couldn't anymore. Derek went first. He was calmer than I expected, and I'll give him this, he looked me in the eye. The bank came back with the requalification terms, he said. We can make it work, but it's going to be tight for a while. The new interest rate without your backing is significantly higher. I nodded. That's how risk is priced, I said. When you stand on your own. He absorbed that, nodded slowly. Melissa had been staring at her coffee cup since she sat down. When she looked up, her eyes were red at the rims. I've been thinking about what I said, she started. On the doorstep. Take your time, I said. I don't think I said it the way I meant it. She paused. I think I meant that sometimes I feel like you check in a lot, and it makes me feel like you don't trust us to handle things. I didn't mean, she stopped. I didn't mean that I wanted you gone, Dad. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. You told me you watched me calling for 4 days and decided not to answer, I said quietly. You told me to my face. I didn't guess at it. I didn't misread it. You told me. She flinched. I know. I need you to understand what those 4 days felt like, I said. Your mother has been gone 6 years. You and Trevor are what I have. I wasn't calling to check up on you or to insert myself. I was calling because a bank document needed a signature, and then because 4 days had gone by and I was genuinely frightened. That's not a character flaw, Melissa. That's a father. She was crying again. Quietly this time, Derek put his hand over hers on the table. I'm not asking for an apology, I said, and I meant it. I'm asking you to actually hear me. Not to manage me, not to handle me, to hear me. The way I have tried to hear you your entire life. The table was quiet for a while. Outside, a neighbor's kid was riding a bike up and down the sidewalk, back and forth, the way kids do when they've got nowhere in particular to be. I watched it through the kitchen window and thought about the evening I taught Melissa to ride a bike in this same driveway, running behind her with my hand on the seat until she didn't need it anymore. She had no idea when I let go. That was the whole point. We talked for 2 hours that afternoon. Not reconciliation, exactly. Not a clean resolution with a bow on it, because those don't exist in real life and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But something honest. Something that hadn't happened in a long time. Before they left, Melissa stood up from the table and hugged me, held on a little longer than she needed to. I let her. Derek shook my hand and looked at the floor and said he was sorry, which I appreciated more than I expected to. I stood in the driveway and watched their car back out and turn up the street and disappear. Then I went to see Patricia Oakes again. I had made an appointment 2 weeks earlier, because some decisions you make before the emotion settles, and then you sit with them long enough to know whether they're still true once the dust clears. They were still true. I want to revise the trust, I told her. Not in anger, with a clear head. She had a notepad ready. She always does. Everything goes to Trevor outright, I said, because Trevor has behaved like a son and he's earned the right to be treated like one. For Melissa, I'm establishing a separate structure. She and Derek will receive a modest annual distribution, enough to know I haven't cut them off, because I haven't. But the rest, the bulk of the estate, the house, the retirement accounts that goes to a foundation, Patricia wrote without comment. Carol was a middle school art teacher for 22 years, I said. We always talked about doing something with her name on it. A scholarship, something for kids who wouldn't otherwise get access to arts education. Kids in parishes like the ones she taught in, where the art budget is the first thing cut and the last thing restored. I paused. That's where it goes. The Carol Annette Calloway Foundation for Arts Education. I should have set it up 6 years ago. Patricia looked up from her notepad. That's a beautiful thing, Robert. It's the right thing, I said, which is not always the same as beautiful, but in this case I think it might be both. I drove home in the early evening, windows down, the September air in Baton Rouge finally dropping to something tolerable after a summer that had outlasted everyone's patience. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a minute, engine off, the way I had sat so many nights over the last 2 months. My phone showed no missed calls. That used to feel like falling. These days, it just feels like quiet. I go out to the backyard most evenings now, where Carol planted a garden she never got to finish, and I have tended it badly and with great love for 6 years. The roses are doing better this fall than they have any right to, given how little I know about roses. I sit out there with the same sweet tea going warm in my hand, and I watch the light change over the yard. I built my career making sure things held up, making sure the math was right so that what I built would not fail the people depending on it. It took me 63 years to understand that you cannot engineer love. You can give it every advantage. You can pour it into the foundation and check it every year and make yourself available every single time it rings. And it will still go its own direction. What you can do is decide, at the end of it all, what your life was actually for. Carol knew the answer to that before I did. She always knew. 34 years in that kitchen, teaching art to kids who had nothing, writing letters to students she hadn't seen in a decade when she heard they'd hit a hard patch. She spent her whole life building something that didn't have her name on it and didn't need to. I should have been paying better attention. The foundation is filed now. The scholarships go out for the first time in the spring. Patricia sent me the paperwork last week, and I sat at the kitchen table and signed it with the same pen Carol kept in the junk drawer for 20 years, the good black one with the weight to it, the one I could never bring myself to throw away. My daughter's voice on the phone these days is different, careful, still, working its way back toward something. We're not where we were, and I am no longer pretending we are. But she calls. She calls on her own, without a reason, just to call. And I answer every time, because I am her father. That is not a condition. It is not a transaction. It is simply the truest thing I have ever been. If this story landed somewhere real for you today, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Hit the like button on your way out. I'll see you on the next one. Loving someone with your whole life doesn't mean holding them so tightly they can't breathe, but it also doesn't mean standing still while they treat your heart like an inconvenience. Robert didn't stop loving his daughter when he stopped covering for her. He just finally loved himself enough to stop disappearing into everyone else's needs. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people you love is let the truth find them on its own. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment while leaving behind something worth carrying. A quiet reminder that love and self-respect were always meant to live in the same house.